Marija Ristic is the regional director of BIRN, of Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, an important organization to investigate also the war crimes, in particular in the Balkans, but of course in Ukraine. It's extremely interesting that they were making the stories, investigating the role of the Serbian fighters on the separatist-led territories in Donbas. So exactly at the Donbas Media Forum, that's where we discuss, but even more we are also interested in what's going on with the investigation of the war crimes, and in the end, does the justice come and how people see that. Marija, thanks for coming here. And really, there are some of the myths that, and not just the myths, we knew that there are foreign fighters, especially from the countries which, let's say, feel some solidarity with Russia, or there was a historical connection. So you made a story on the Serbian fighters in the Donbas. So how much do we know about that? What is their role? What's happening with them now?
There are no clear numbers how many people went there. What we at BIRN did is that we tried to trace around 20 of them that we knew that went from either Serbia or Bosnia to different parts of Ukraine to fight on the Russian side. And interesting thing is how we actually got to investigate these topics is that most of these fighters we actually knew from the Balkan Wars. So these were experienced fighters fighting on different fronts, either in Croatia or in Bosnia, that we knew, some of them from war crime trials in Serbia, some from different reports. And then we used actually Facebook to trace where they are and what they're doing. Because during the Balkan Wars, most of the fighters who fought in different paramilitary units like to take pictures, and a lot of these pictures back then in the 90s were not posted online, but they were saved on cameras and other things. However, they continued the same model in Ukrainian war. It's just that they were posting pictures on Facebook and online and basically bragging how they are fighting and defending the Orthodox Brotherhood and the Russian goal in Ukraine. Most of them were quite open to speak about what they are doing in Ukraine, because according to them, none of the things that they were doing and fighting were not either illegal or considered wrong. They simply saw it as paying the debt of the Russian fighters that were fighting in the Balkan Wars. So at the beginning when this started, that was actually 2014, and then beginning of 2015, and in between actually Serbia adopted the law criminalizing foreign fighters potentially fighting in the other conflicts, including Middle East and Ukraine. So this is where the problem actually became for them to return to Serbia. And then we tried to trace those who returned. Some of them who returned were actually traced by the Serbian prosecution and made a plea bargains, most of them. And they either served 2 to 1 year, depending on the profile of the fighters, but a lot of them actually are still in Ukraine, and some of them are actually in the Wagner unit, and we were able to trace them also in Syria.
If we come about the Wagner unit,
yes.
What exactly do we know they were doing in Ukraine, apart from being present?
What is interesting with Wagner is when you compare it with the Balkans, it's actually a very similar model that already existed in our war. So it's the unit that is paid by a state or different actors close to the state that has very experienced fighters as part of the units, and that goes from one conflict to the other and fights. How we actually reached to the Wagner is that there was one very notorious unit in the Balkans called Arkan fighters, and most of the fighters there were professional fighters. And we, through our investigation of war crimes, managed to have contact with some of them. And then we discovered that few of the former Arkan fighters are now in Russia. And then some other people who were trying to flee, to actually go to Ukraine to fight, were telling us, we are in contact with this and this person who is in Russia. He is the one who is helping us to reach to Ukraine. And then we discovered a network of a few fighters, already experienced fighters from the Balkans War, who are actually recruiting first group, the people who already fought in the Balkans War and want to fight for money. And then the other group were actually young people, usually members of different far-right groups, some of them actually football fans, who for different reasons also decided to join them. So then when we discovered who are the key people in the Wagner unit from the Balkans, we contacted them, and most of them, of course, denied that they ever participated in any war, although we found some of their pictures in Ukraine. But what is interesting is that our final proof that they actually moved to Syria was when one of the Wagner members, actually from the town of Novi Sad, which is a town in northern Serbia, actually died in the Syrian war. So his body was actually moved from Syria to Novi Sad, and the last trace we had from him is that he was in Moscow. So for us, that was a clear proof of what several other people already told us, is how is Wagner moving from one conflict to the other.
We don't know exactly the number, but really it's about what are they doing. So really, are they more trainers?
The group that is called the experienced fighters, the fighters from the Balkans. You have to know that there is, as I mentioned, this Arkan unit. So their model is basically the same. There is a part of the unit that trains the staff, the soldiers, and there is part of the unit that are actually soldiers. So even back in the Balkans, they had their own training camp, and from there they recruited the soldiers, and the soldiers were going there. So in these training camps, there were several people who were like the leading members of the camp, and it appeared that some of these members of the unit are actually now in Wagner, some of them as trainers, some of them as fighters. They would never say they train for a war, but if you know who these people were at the Balkan War, and if you have some other people who are claiming that they were their contacts to go to Ukraine, and that with them they actually reach out Ukraine, and that they are their contact points, then it's also clear what is their role now.
For instance, can you give us a couple of examples of the people, you know, whom you can say that their past is kind of dubious, to know that what they are teaching here, let's say, that could be pretty, like, say, questionable?
Yes. So one of them that we found is Dragan Savicic, and he is called Wolf. That's his nickname. Of course, I have to say that he denies everything. He was a member of the Arkan unit in the early 90s. He fought in war in Bosnia. Then he lived for a long time in Montenegro. And while he was in Montenegro, he was actually indicted for various criminal activities. Shooting, mafia wars, and things like that. However, he managed to escape Montenegro and fled to Russia. His official story is that in Russia he works for a construction company, and that he never went to any kind of war. Some of them, for example, there was an interesting case that I followed, a case of a war crime trial in Serbia for Kosovo crimes. And I actually interviewed this also former member of the Arkan unit. And at one point of the trial, he just disappeared. And then we managed to trace that he actually fled a war crime trial in Serbia, and that he fled to Ukraine and joined Wagner. But all other members that we talked were either former members of Arkan unit, or different paramilitaries, or different members of the criminal gangs. But when we say criminal gangs, it's not like an Italian criminal gang, but it's in the Balkans, criminal gangs actually erupted after the end of the war, when most of the soldiers couldn't fight anymore, but then they formed these gangs. So most of the gang members were actually former fighters. So this was just another way to do criminal activities. And then at one point, as I said, the situation in Ukraine, it appeared for them to be very similar to the one we had in the Balkans, and they found a way, of course, to earn money, not just through fighting, because that's also one important thing, is that these units were not just fighting, but also doing a lot of robberies and a lot of additional criminal activities, trafficking and different kind of, as I said, criminal acts.
And the obvious question from a Ukrainian then, okay, these people are coming to our land, but what happened with them after the war? For instance, why they were from the beginning free, why they would come, you know? I mean, have they served their time? No?
I think this will also be important for the Ukrainian prosecutors, because it was very difficult for the Balkan prosecutors and also the international prosecutors to prove these crimes and to prove the command responsibility, because these units were very smart. They often wear masks. They were often going to the areas where no one knows them. They often try to destroy every possible link with their funders and with their sponsors. So it was always very difficult for some of them to be prosecuted. The other aspect is that they remained very well connected to the police, to the army, to the different aspects of the ministries, especially in Serbia, different protection units that are now operating. So they always managed to evade justice. I mentioned the case of a guy who was even on a war crime trial and managed to escape to Ukraine to fight. So this is the level of absurdity, I would say, we have in the Balkans when it comes to the prosecution of the very important people who committed war crimes.
One of the questions which is often now not like debated, it's very early, but just coming to the place is a question of the amnesty. In case of any kind of reconciliation or agreement Ukraine might ever have. And always there is a distinction that in the end, like the people who fought and had blood on their hands won't be amnested, while, for instance, the people who didn't, they would. And we just recently talked, for instance, to the former Minister of Interior of Colombia, who had this practice and explained how it worked. But my question is that, like, how do you define, how do you prove that the guy A didn't kill anybody and the guy B killed anybody? Because if the person used to be in the military unit during the war, you know, it's very hard for a person imagine how and then police prove who was the person from the unit committing the crime and who was just on the checkpoint.
A lot of the prosecutions are focusing on foot soldiers. For example, International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia that was established actually focused on command responsibility, which is much easier to prove. You simply have an appointed commander, you have his area of responsibility. Did in his area of responsibility crimes have been committed? Yes. Then you have a person who is guilty, because according to the Geneva Convention, he should have prevented the crime. So you as a prosecutor should actually focus on the people who are high in the chain, because for them the crimes are very easy to prove. And you have an experience of Germany, who actually at the late stage changed its prosecutorial strategy and said, look, we don't want to focus on these foot soldiers because they were anyway part of the chain. Let's focus on the commanders. And if you change the strategy and focus on these people, then it's much easier when it comes to prosecution to prove it. The problem in the Balkans was that the ICTY was going really after big heads. The local prosecutors, because of the political pressure, went only for the direct foot soldiers, which is very difficult to prove. And then you have this middle part of people who are still very powerful in the Balkans, who are free. They control the army, they still control the police, so they constantly put pressure on the prosecution, and then you basically don't have quality war crimes prosecution.
What do you do with the foot soldiers? Because it's no question that the commanders have to be responsible, have to be held responsible. But now, for instance, the amnesty, like potential amnesty, is really the thing which, because it's about the justice. And, you know, like still for the people it will be very hard to comprehend. They want both. The commanders, but also the people who killed somebody to be persecuted and not just to be free.
I think the amnesty story is the story about peace. And that's the debate also about journalism, whether journalists should contribute to peace or not. My personal opinion is that peace is not necessarily linked to journalism. You as a journalist are obliged to report about injustice, irregularities, important things for your democratic society, but you don't necessarily need to contribute to the peace. For us, our job was always to document and pinpoint on the alleged war criminals. For the foot soldiers, I think in some cases in the Balkans, it was easy when the foot soldiers were neighbors. So in some of the war crime cases, we had, for example, neighbors shooting on each other. So it was easier for prosecutors to prove the case. Simply you will have 5 witnesses from one village who will say that and that person actually committed a war crime. And this is how the foot soldiers were convicted in the Balkans. Other foot soldiers were not, simply because they couldn't be identified.
You mentioned the case of the Serbian fighters in the case of the Donbas.
Yes.
I wonder how much we ever have traced about the participation of the Serbians in the case of the annexation of Crimea, as I personally remember being in Crimea during the time of the annexation, sitting in Sevastopol with a group of the guys coming from Novi Sad. You know, we've been to the same restaurant, they definitely look like the fighters, like big, tall guys. So what might, at that time, of course, there were no, let's say, there were not, it was pure like the war, but it was annexation and the force was used. And there were threats against the people. That's how those annexations had happened. What do you know about that?
Well, in case of Crimea, I think it was even more extreme because Serbia never hid its own agenda on Crimea, although our president just 3 days ago said that we respect Ukrainian integrity. But beside the fighters in Crimea, we also had our parliament members, like the official Serbian parliament members, going to Crimea for the election observing. So for me, this was also like one more example showing that, that the narrative of Serbian fighters is something that is more or less something that is actually official narrative of the state, because these members of the Serbian parliament were actually members of the ruling party. So, I mean, it's obvious that you will have people fighting there if you have parliamentarians going to Crimea and accepting the Russian.
One of the questions where, for instance, transitional justice in Ukraine today is probably the most important at this particular moment is the issue of the exchange, prisoners exchange. Because therefore we really understand there is no concept in the law where a person, a human, should be exchanged for another human. It's overall hostages exchange. And we had that issue with Russia, we had this issue, and we know that our courts had to take the decision to free some of the people to give them in order to get back the Ukrainian fighters or just political prisoners. So in that regard, what kind of a framework that could be, where we go with this, you know, the clearly illegal process, while it's the only process. And honestly, I would welcome, anybody would welcome the process if there is a chance to exchange the prisoners.
Well, as you rightly said, basically what's the problem with the transitional justice is that there are some elements which are defined through different UN conventions, different laws, like through Geneva Convention, but in essence, the field is absolutely not regulated, and you just have one experience from one conflict to the other. In the case of the Balkans and in the other conflicts as well, there were exchanges of people. We had in different areas of the Balkans different concepts. In some cases, it was just a pure agreement, like two political leaders agreed to exchange people, and they exchange it, political prisoners. In some cases, it was even a law, where it says these people will be freed and they will not be prosecuted again. But what it happened after is that even when these people were released and even when they were exchanged, and although there were pledges there will be no prosecution, prosecution still happened. So even though people were said that they will be not prosecuted, they were. There was also extreme cases in Bosnia where people would agree to exchange and then the exchange would not happen and people would get killed.
And in our case, even it happened that the people are already behind the bars in the official courts. So the courts are forced to come up to some statement and pardon this person because they're already behind the bars. The court just can't throw them out.
Yeah, we had the same case in Serbia with the Kosovar political prisoners, and that was one part of our democratic transition, if you want to call it like that. It is just that Serbia passed a law where it says that all political prisoners will be released because this was part of the agreement, and they were released. There were cases later where they would be arrested on the border, but as I said, this was regulated through an act. So it was, I think it was actually pushed by international community at that time, because when the Kosovo War ended, there were a lot of people who were in Serbian prisons accused of terrorism and different acts, and in 99% of the cases these were all political cases. There were no evidence, so it was just basically at that point terror of the Serbian state towards an Albanian ethnic minority.